I knew something was wrong the morning I heard the sharp sound of shoes grinding into wet grass right outside my bedroom window. It wasn't the first time, but this time, it felt deliberate. I pulled back the curtain and there she was again, Karen, marching right across my lawn like it was a public sidewalk. No hesitation. No apology. No respect. My heart raced with frustration. I had spent months caring for that lawn, reseeding, watering, trimming every edge until it looked like a carpet of green. But to her, it was just the shortest path to the HOA mailbox. She didn't even look down. She didn't care. When I stepped outside and called after her, she turned slowly, lifting her sunglasses with an expression that made my blood boil, that smug little smirk that said, "What are you going to do about it?" She waved dismissively and said, "It's community property. Deal with it." Community property? No. My deed said otherwise. That was the day the story really began. I tried being polite at first. I put up a small sign, "Please do not walk on grass." The next morning, the sign was snapped in half and tossed beside my porch. I left a friendly note on her door, respectful, calm, reasonable. She posted it in the HOA Facebook group and mocked me publicly. The comments rolled in. Typical new homeowner. He needs to toughen up. Karen's lived here for years. He should adapt. I wasn't the villain, but they painted me as one. Every day, it got worse. She started dragging friends along the path. Kids raced bicycles across the yard. Footprints carved a dirt scar straight through the center like a permanent wound. My home didn't feel like mine anymore, it felt invaded. But the moment that changed everything was the night I caught her walking across my lawn in heels during a thunderstorm while talking on her phone, laughing about it. That was when I stopped asking politely. That was when I decided. If she wanted a shortcut through my yard, I'd give her an experience she would never forget. The next morning, I walked into the HOA clubhouse determined to prove that my lawn wasn't a shortcut, it was my property. Karen sat near the front, whispering confidently to the board as if the outcome was already decided. I carried photos, survey papers, and a calm promise that I only wanted respect. When I spoke, I explained the damage, the muddy trench, the broken sign, and how every footprint felt like someone trespassing through my home. Some neighbors nodded, but Karen rolled her eyes and said I was dramatic, claiming that walking across the grass was a harmless habit everyone enjoyed. The chairperson cleared his throat and announced that the HOA couldn't enforce personal boundaries unless a barrier existed, and that residents were free to choose the most efficient route. The phrase burned in my chest, and Karen smiled triumphantly, certain she had won. I walked home in silence, rain drifting across the street while the path in my yard glistened like a scar. I realized that asking nicely or appealing to rules wasn't enough. I needed something clever, something undeniable, something that would make every shortcut walker rethink their decision. That night, I paced the hallway, replaying the meeting and the laughter that followed. I studied the slope of the yard, the shadows from the porch light, and the exact stretch where Karen's heels always struck. A plan formed slowly, built not on anger but on patience and precision, a trap that would humiliate no one yet expose every step. I measured the pathway, marked subtle points with chalk, and visited the hardware store before closing. The clerk asked what I was building. I smiled carefully and said it was for garden maintenance, which wasn't exactly a lie. By midnight, the idea had become a blueprint, and my frustration had turned into cold, focused determination. I wasn't looking for revenge, I wanted accountability, proof that my yard mattered and that boundaries deserved recognition. If Karen insisted on cutting across my lawn, then the lawn itself would finally answer her. And when morning arrived, my trap would be waiting, silent, harmless, unforgettable, and impossible to ignore. Before I went to sleep, I stood at the window and watched the wind ripple across the grass, wondering whether Karen would notice anything different. She never paid attention, and that certainty fueled my resolve. Tomorrow, the shortcut would no longer feel effortless, it would speak, loudly, without me saying a single word. Behind the curtain, I rehearsed every possibility, every reaction, every excuse she might throw back at me, and I felt strangely calm. Whatever happened next, I would finally reclaim my space, and the neighborhood would see the truth for themselves. Morning was coming, and so was Karen's lesson at last. By sunrise, the trap blended perfectly into the yard, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking closely. I'd installed thin motion stakes beneath the soil, connected to a compact sprinkler valve and a harmless dye mixture that gardeners use to mark growth lines. If someone crossed, they'd be greeted by a tall cold plume of blue mist, impossible to ignore and impossible to explain away. I waited on the porch, coffee warming my hands, heart steady yet alert. The neighborhood felt ordinary, birds chattering, doors opening, tires humming along the street. Then I heard the familiar cadence of Karen's heels, tapping with that entitled rhythm that always cut straight across the grass. She didn't glance at the walkway. She didn't hesitate. She lifted her phone, laughing about a lunch reservation, and stepped into the center of the path. The yard answered. A sudden hiss broke the quiet, followed by a rising jet of shimmering dye that burst upward like a miniature fountain. The mist wrapped around her legs, swirling across her shoes, freckles of bright blue splashing against her skirt. Karen shrieked, stumbling back, staring in disbelief as the color deepened with every second. Neighbors peeked from porches, drawn by the sound. One man whispered what happened, while another began recording, the camera catching the unmistakable footprints glowing across the lawn. The dye didn't stain permanently, but it clung long enough to reveal every trespass like a signature. Karen spun around, furious, demanding to know who had done this, insisting it was sabotage and harassment. I stepped forward calmly, explaining that the device was on my property, entirely legal, and triggered only when someone walked where they didn't belong. The board president, now standing at the curb, stared silently at the blue trail leading from the sidewalk to her shoes. For the first time, there was proof, undeniable, irrefutable, and public. Karen's smirk vanished, replaced with a trembling anger that couldn't hide the embarrassment flooding her face. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I simply said that boundaries matter, and that my lawn was not a shortcut. The street fell silent as everyone absorbed what they'd just seen, and I knew nothing in this neighborhood would be quite the same again. But even as the mist faded and the sprinklers clicked to a stop, I sensed this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the kind to accept consequences quietly. She gathered herself, clenched her jaw, and promised the board that she would take care of this. Her words weren't loud, but they carried a threat, one that drifted across the yard heavier than the blue droplets drying on the grass. I watched her leave, already planning her next move, and realized my trap had awakened something she wouldn't ignore after all. That afternoon the neighborhood buzzed like a shaken beehive, and every whispered conversation carried my name through the cul-de-sac. Some neighbors praised the trap as clever, others called it petty, but everyone agreed Karen had finally been exposed. I should have felt triumphant, yet an uneasy chill followed me back inside the house. By evening, clouds pressed low across the sky, and the wind creaked against the gutters. I reviewed the footage a neighbor shared, watching the blue mist burst upward again and again, each replay tightening my stomach. The trap had worked, but Karen was humiliated, and humiliation is a spark she never lets die. A knock rattled the door. When I opened it, the board president stood on the porch beside Karen, her arms folded, her jaw tight. He asked if we could resolve tensions peacefully. Karen didn't look at me, she stared past my shoulder and accused me of orchestrating public humiliation. I replied that I had only protected my property. The president suggested mediation, but Karen refused, promising a formal complaint. That night I walked the perimeter of the yard, tracing the faint blue footprints dissolving into dew. I wondered whether the battle had just begun. The trap had drawn a line, Yet lines invite challengers. The following morning, a crisp envelope waited on my doorstep. Inside lay a citation and a notice demanding removal of unapproved mechanical installations. My jaw tightened. Karen had gone straight to the bylaws. Instead of panicking, I gathered documents, receipts, and photographs, building a timeline of trespass, damage, and warnings. If they wanted a hearing, I would arrive prepared. I wasn't seeking revenge anymore, I sought clarity, proof that respect isn't optional. As the sun slid across the windows, I realized the real confrontation hadn't happened yet. Karen believed rules could erase consequences. I intended to show her that accountability travels farther than any shortcut. The hearing was coming, and with it, the truth. I steadied myself, breathing slowly, and promised that no matter how loudly she argued, I would hold to the facts. The lawn had spoken once, now it was my turn to speak for it. I placed every document into a neat folder, slid the citation on top, and felt the weight of the neighborhood settle across my shoulders. Outside, the grass shimmered in the breeze, no footprints, no shortcuts, only silence waiting for the next step. Whatever happened at the hearing, I knew one thing for certain, I wouldn't back down again. Respect had a price, and I was finally willing to pay it. The clock ticked toward the date, each hour tightening not inside my chest, yet sharpening my resolve. Karen had chosen the battlefield, but the truth would walk beside me into the room. The hearing room felt colder than the weather outside, and every chair scraped across the tile like a warning as neighbors filtered in to watch. I sat near the front with my folder balanced on my knees, heart steady, voice rehearsed for what waited ahead inside. Karen arrived moments later, surrounded by board members who spoke in hushed tones meant to sound official. She never looked at the photographs pinned to the display board, she stared at me instead, confident the citation would erase everything the die had revealed from the ground. When my name was called, I rose slowly and laid out the timeline, each page sliding forward like a step across the yard. I described the broken signs, the storms, the messages, and the morning the trap spoke louder than any argument the neighborhood could witness. Gasps rippled through the room when the blue footprints appeared on the monitor. The president leaned forward, elbows tight, studying the trail that led from sidewalk to heels. For once, no one could call it exaggeration or rumor, the evidence glittered unapologetically before their eyes today. Karen stood quickly and argued that the trap was humiliating, reckless, and designed to target her alone. I answered calmly that it triggered for anyone, and that dozens of requests to respect the property had been ignored until the lawn finally defended itself without causing harm. Silence spread again, heavier now, and one board member asked whether I would remove the system if they recognized my right to protect the yard. I nodded, explaining that I wanted cooperation, not conflict, only acknowledgement that boundaries deserved more than shortcuts through daily convenience alone. After a long whispering pause, the president announced their decision: the citation would be withdrawn, my property rights affirmed, and the HOA would install a decorative barrier at their expense to guide foot traffic away from the grass. A murmur rolled across the room like thunder. Karen stared at the floor, the confidence gone, replaced by a thin, brittle quiet. She didn't apologize, yet the path across my lawn no longer belonged to her. The shortcut had vanished, replaced by a line everyone in the neighborhood finally respected from that moment forward. Walking home afterward, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders as the wind combed gently across the restored grass. The battle had never been about pride, it was about dignity, about the place I called home, and the voice it deserved to carry forever onward. As the sun settled behind the rooftops, I glanced once more at the quiet lawn and understood that respect doesn't arrive through anger, it arrives through truth revealed in daylight. The trap was gone, but its lesson remained, rooted deeper than the grass beneath every step. The days after the hearing felt surreal. Walking outside, I noticed the subtle shift in the neighborhood. People no longer cut across my lawn. Footsteps had been replaced by careful detours along sidewalks and designated pathways. Even Karen didn't dare approach my yard the same way. She walked past with measured, hesitant steps, the arrogance she once carried replaced by a cautious silence. Neighbors stopped by more often, not just to check the yard but to exchange quiet congratulations. One elderly man nodded as he passed. "That was the smartest thing I've seen in years. You didn't escalate, you just proved a point." Another waved from across the street, a mix of respect and amusement in her expression. Even the kids, who had once raced across my lawn like it was a playground, now tiptoed along the sidewalk as if afraid of waking the ghosts of the blue footprints. Karen, of course, remained a fixture in the neighborhood gossip. I could hear whispers from porches and behind fences, sometimes praising, sometimes questioning. But the truth was that the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. She had learned, whether she admitted it or not, that shortcuts carried consequences, and that respecting boundaries was not optional. The HOA, too, adjusted. They placed small decorative fences and clear pathways along the properties that were constantly borrowed by residents, reducing conflicts and awkward confrontations. What had started as one person's frustration had transformed into a broader awareness. Community spaces needed respect, and sometimes a little creativity was necessary to teach that lesson. I spent time restoring my lawn to its original perfection, patching grass, trimming edges, and making sure that every corner felt like mine again. But I realized something more important had grown during this time: my confidence. Standing up for myself, for my property, for the small line of respect that everyone deserves, had changed me. I no longer felt powerless against anyone, even the most entitled neighbors. Late at night, I'd still think about the blue footprints, the hiss of the sprinkler, and the expressions of shock that had rippled through the neighborhood. It wasn't about revenge, it was about establishing what was right. And now, with the yard restored and boundaries acknowledged, I could finally relax. As the wind blew gently across the grass, carrying the faint scent of earth and freshly cut lawn, I smiled. The fight was over, the lesson learned, and the yard had spoken for me, louder than any argument ever could. It had been a few weeks since the hearing, and life in the neighborhood had settled into a peaceful rhythm. My lawn was pristine again, sunlight glinting off the dew in the early mornings, and for the first time in months, I felt genuinely at home. But I knew Karen. I had watched her carefully over the years. She didn't accept defeat quietly. One morning, I saw her across the street, lingering near the new decorative barrier the HOA had installed. Her arms were folded, eyes scanning the lawn with that familiar, calculating gaze. I sipped my coffee and waited, knowing instinctively that she was planning one last move. By mid-afternoon, it became clear. Karen had brought tools, small gardening implements, a folding chair, and a measuring tape. She crouched just beyond the barrier, pretending to tend to her own yard, but her gaze never left mine. I didn't confront her, I didn't have to. I could see the challenge in her posture, a silent declaration that she wasn't finished yet. I decided on patience. I knew she wanted a reaction, an argument, a confrontation. Instead, I walked slowly to the porch and simply watched, calm and composed. Every fiber of her plan became visible to me. She measured angles, calculated a possible shortcut, even plotted where her friends might stand if she needed witnesses. After almost an hour, she finally gave up, or perhaps realized she had nothing left to gain. She packed her tools, gave me one last glare, and walked away, carefully navigating around the barrier. Her steps were hesitant, unlike the confident strides she had once taken. In that moment, I understood that control doesn't always come from confrontation, it comes from consistency, preparation, and calm resolve. The neighborhood watched quietly too. Some neighbors waved at me as they walked past, others whispered to each other, noticing the subtle change in Karen's demeanor. She had tried one last time to challenge my space, and for the first time, she had failed without creating a scene. I spent the rest of the day tending the lawn, trimming edges, and watering the freshly cut grass. With every movement, I felt a sense of closure settling in. Karen's challenge had been neutralized, not by anger or escalation, but by strategy, patience, and the simple refusal to bend. That evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, casting long shadows across the grass, I finally allowed myself to relax completely. My lawn was safe. My home was respected. And for the first time, I realized that the battle had taught me something far more valuable than winning. It had taught me self-assurance, patience, and the quiet power of persistence. Weeks turned into months, and the once contentious street began to feel like a true neighborhood again. The tension that had lingered between houses dissolved gradually, replaced by small acts of civility. Neighbors now waved when passing, children played in designated areas rather than darting across lawns, and the quiet beauty of a well-kept community finally returned. Karen, predictably, had retreated into her usual routines, but there was a subtle change in the way she moved through the neighborhood. The smug confidence was replaced with careful calculation, her shortcuts now replaced with longer, more deliberate walks. Even when our eyes met across the street, her gaze held a measure of respect I hadn't seen before. It was not a victory born of revenge, but of boundaries upheld and lessons learned. I spent more time observing the world around my home. Small moments revealed the difference patience and strategy could make. The HOA began placing subtle markers in other areas where boundaries had been ignored, inspired by my approach. Neighbors began considering the impact of their actions on others, even without explicit rules. My lawn had done more than survive Karen's footsteps, it had taught accountability in a quiet, undeniable way. As I tended to the grass, trimming each blade and making the edges perfect, I reflected on the lessons of the past months. Confrontation can ignite chaos, but patience, strategy, and calm action bring resolution. A lawn is more than grass, it is a line, a boundary, and a symbol of respect. Protecting it became a lesson not just in ownership, but in persistence and courage. Even Karen's presence no longer carried the threat it once had. Her influence had diminished not because I humiliated her, but because I acted decisively, without anger, and allowed the truth to speak for itself. Each morning, as the sun gleamed off the dew-kissed grass, I felt pride in the quiet strength I had discovered within myself. Neighbors stopped by occasionally to admire the lawn, complimenting its neatness and the clever solution that had settled the long-standing tension. Some confessed they had doubted my approach at first, yet seeing the results, they were compelled to acknowledge that standing firm without aggression could indeed change dynamics. I understood now that respect is earned through consistency, patience, and courage. My lawn had been my teacher as much as it had been my battleground, and the victory was far deeper than anyone could see. As evening approached, the street grew quiet, leaving only the sound of wind through the trees and the gentle rustle of grass. I smiled, knowing that some lessons don't come from arguments, they come from steadfast action and the wisdom to wait. Months had passed since the trap, the hearing, and Karen's final hesitant steps around the barrier. The neighborhood had transformed in ways that were subtle but undeniable. What once had been tension, whispers, and territorial disputes now felt like a community learning to respect each other's space. My lawn, once a battleground, had become a symbol of quiet authority and earned boundaries. I often stood on the porch in the mornings, coffee in hand, and watched neighbors pass respectfully along the sidewalks. Children laughed and played in areas clearly marked for them, while adults moved with awareness, no longer encroaching on someone else's carefully maintained space. Even Karen, who once strode across my yard without hesitation, now walked with caution along the edges of her own property, occasionally glancing toward the lawn that had taught her such a hard lesson. The experience had changed me, too. I realized that the battle was never really about grass or trespassing, it was about standing up for myself, maintaining dignity, and asserting boundaries with thoughtfulness and precision. I had learned patience, strategic thinking, and the power of calm resolve, lessons that extended far beyond the yard itself. As I walked the perimeter of my property, inspecting the edges and the lush green blades, I felt an unspoken satisfaction. Every step I took was measured, deliberate, and respectful, the same way I had demanded others walk. I could feel the quiet strength in knowing that respect cannot be forced, but it can be earned, and once it is, it leaves a lasting impression. Karen's attempts at disruption were now just memories, faint echoes of blue footprints that had long faded into the past. The neighborhood had shifted, not because of intimidation or conflict, but because of strategy, patience, and a commitment to what was right. The lawn, in its own silent way, had spoken louder than any argument, louder than any complaint, and louder than Karen's once entitled footsteps. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and cast a golden glow across the perfectly trimmed grass, I felt a profound sense of closure. The battle was over, the lesson learned, and the peace earned. The yard was no longer just a patch of green, it was a testament to resilience, thoughtfulness, and the quiet courage required to stand up when necessary. For anyone watching, the story of my lawn and Karen serves as a reminder: standing firm with calm determination is more powerful than confrontation, and boundaries are worth defending not with anger, but with wisdom. My lawn had won the battle, and I had gained something far more valuable: confidence, respect, and a neighborhood that finally understood that some lines should never be crossed. The street grew quiet, the wind rustled softly through the trees, and the lawn glistened in the last rays of sunlight, proof that patience, courage, and strategy always leave a lasting mark.